This report presents a factual examination of African individuals who arrived in what is now the United States, spanning from the early colonial period through 1865, when slavery was legally abolished, and extending to voluntary migrations thereafter. It details key figures, estimated arrival numbers, methods of transit, named migration eras, and significant events based on historical records, covering both Spanish and English colonial territories, the broader scope of the transatlantic slave trade, and post-slavery immigration. Additionally, it quantifies the total African arrivals during the slave trade era and addresses their scale and origins, culminating in an overview of the current population of Africans and their descendants in America as of the latest data. Juan Garrido, born in West Africa around 1480, is one of the earliest recorded free African individuals to reach what would later become U.S. territory. He arrived in Florida in 1513 as part of Juan Ponce de Leon's Spanish expedition, participating as a conquistador rather than in servitude. Having likely established his free status in Spain or Portugal prior to the journey, Garrido traveled across the Atlantic on Spanish ships, marking an early instance of a free African presence in American history, nearly a century before English colonization began. Historical evidence suggests that other free or semi-free Africans may have accompanied similar Spanish expeditions, though detailed records from this period are sparse. Before 1619, when the 20-and-odd Africans arrived in Virginia under English control, the African population in areas now part of the U.S. was limited and primarily associated with Spanish colonization efforts. In St. Augustine, Florida, established in 1565 as the oldest continuous European settlement in the present-day U.S., an estimated 20 to 50 African residents were present by 1619. This population included both enslaved individuals and a smaller number of free Africans who arrived via Spanish ships as soldiers, laborers, or craftsmen. Earlier expeditions, such as those led by Pánfilo de Narváez in 1528 and Hernando de Soto from 1539 to 1543, transported additional Africans, including Estebanico, who shifted from enslavement to a more autonomous role, to regions like Florida and the Southeast, though these groups did not establish permanent settlements. In contrast, English colonies like Jamestown, founded in 1607, have no recorded African residents before 1619, indicating a pre-1619 total of approximately 20 to 60 African individuals, predominantly in Spanish Florida. In 1619, approximately 20 to 30 Africans, known as the 20-and-odd, arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, aboard the White Lion, an English privateer ship that had captured them from a Portuguese vessel, the São João Bautista, in the Gulf of Mexico. These Africans, originating from the Ndongo Kingdom in present-day Angola, were transported across the Atlantic as part of the early transatlantic slave trade and traded to English colonists for provisions. Slavery was a recognized practice in the colony, and while they arrived in bondage, some, such as Anthony Johnson, later became free landowners by the 1630s after serving as indentured servants. This event underpins the New York Times 1619 Project, launched in 2019, which designates 1619 as a key marker in the history of Africans in English America, distinct from earlier Spanish encounters with free West Africans like Garrido. From 1619 to 1865, when slavery ended with the 13th Amendment, free African arrivals to what became the U.S. were significantly outnumbered by the enslaved population transported through the transatlantic slave trade. Free arrivals occurred in smaller numbers across distinct periods. Early colonial period, 1619 to 1700. Dozens of free Africans, likely from the West Indies such as Bermuda, arrived in English colonies via maritime trade routes. 18th century, several hundred free individuals, often sailors or traders from Caribbean regions like Barbados, including Barbadians of African descent, reached port cities through shipping networks. 19th century, after the 1808 ban on the international slave trade, an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 free individuals arrived, including Haitian migrants of African descent following Haiti's 1804 revolution and approximately 1,000 to 2,000 recaptives liberated from intercepted slave ships, primarily of African origin, resettled by the U.S. Navy. In total, approximately 5,000 to 15,000 free African and Caribbean individuals arrived during this 246-year span. Meanwhile, the free African-descended population within the U.S., including those born or manumitted locally, reached 488,070 by 1860, according to census records, though this figure reflects residents rather than new arrivals. The transatlantic slave trade, spanning from 1526 to its legal end in the U.S. in 1808, with some illegal activity persisting until 1865, brought a substantial number of Africans to what is now U.S. territory. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, approximately 12.5 million Africans were embarked from Africa to the Americas overall, with 389,000 arriving directly in the mainland U.S. between 1526 and 1865. These individuals were forcibly transported on slave ships from West and Central African regions, including Senegambia, 15%, the Bight of Benin, 11%, the Bight of Biafra, 23%, and West Central Africa, e.g., Angola, 40%. The peak period was 1701 to 1800, when 291,000 arrived, followed by 51,000 from 1801 to 1865. Post-ban arrivals were illicit. Ships like the Clotilda, the last known U.S. slave ship, landed 110 Africans in Alabama in 1860. This total excludes those born in the U.S., with an estimated 588,000 African-descended individuals, both enslaved and free, living in the U.S. by 1790, per the first census, growing to 4.4 million by 1860. Since the abolition of slavery in 1865, African migration to the U.S. has been voluntary, driven by economic, educational, and political factors, and facilitated primarily by steamships and, later, air travel. Historical data outline distinct eras and numbers. Post-Civil War to 1960s, migration was minimal due to restrictive U.S. immigration policies, with fewer than 81,000 Africans arriving by 1970, mostly from the Caribbean via maritime routes. 1965 to 2000, modern wave. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, ending nationality-based quotas, led to 881,300 African immigrants by 2000, with arrivals from Nigeria, Ghana, and Ethiopia by air, often fleeing conflicts like the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970, or seeking education. 2000-present, the African-born population reached 2.1 million by 2017 and surpassed 2.4 million by 2024, per estimates, with significant numbers from Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Kenya via diversity visas and refugee programs. Named migrations include the modern African wave, post-1965, contrasting with the forced transatlantic slave trade, 1526 to 1867. Since 1990, approximately 50,000 Africans have arrived annually, exceeding peak slave trade years, facilitated by legal immigration channels like the U.S. Diversity Visa Program. The history of African arrivals in America encompasses the early presence of free West Africans like Juan Garrido in 1513, the forced migration of the 20 and odd in 1619 under English rule, and the broader transatlantic slave trade that delivered 389,000 Africans by 1865. Free African and Caribbean arrivals from 1619 to 1865 totaled 5,000 to 15,000, while post-slavery voluntary migration added over 2.4 million by 2024, reshaping demographics through eras like the modern African wave. As of 2022, the total population of African immigrants and their descendants exceeds 47 million, including 4.6 million foreign-born Africans, 2019 data, and a broader African American population tied to both historical slave trade arrivals and modern immigration. This factual record, based on data as of March 2025, outlines the scope and evolution of African migration to America across centuries, from involuntary migration to voluntary journeys.